Hello and welcome to my series of conversations with men and women as ideas, vision and philosophy help define our contemporary world. My guest today has so dramatically and significantly increased, enhanced, pushed the boundaries of our understanding of modern approaches to psychiatry, to consciousness, building bridges between the Eastern vocabulary and the Western vocabulary of psychiatry. He has written extensively, published more than 20 books, 150 professional articles, has been a founding philosopher, agent for change with transpersonal psychology, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Stanislav Grof. I'm already sort of stumbling and struggling for words. I've read Spiritual Emergency, a book of yours, and it's a very profound, significant articulation of spiritual experiences. What is a modern psychiatrist who trained initially, at least in the Western tradition, doing looking at issues of spiritual emergencies?
Very frequently my professional colleagues wonder how somebody with all the right credentials and background in medicine, in psychology, could take spirituality seriously and mysticism and write books with very funny titles like Beyond the Brain or Spiritual Emergency and so on. So what happened to me, I went to study medicine explicitly with the purpose of becoming a psychoanalyst. I got very excited reading Freud. I originally wanted to work in animated movies, and I already had my first interview. I was supposed to start working in the Barrandov film studios in Prague, where I was born and educated. And a friend of mine gave me introductory lectures to psychoanalysis by Freud, and I read it through the night. I couldn't sleep, and within a week I decided it's going to be psychiatry, not the animated movies. But I got into a state of kind of a deep conflict about psychoanalysis. The indication range is very narrow. You have to meet very special criteria to be a good candidate for psychoanalysis. And even if you meet the criteria, you have to prepare yourself for a very, very long time.
Well, sort of, to illustrate this, perhaps is, the notion that you have a 15-point scale for depression, and if you get 9 points, you're depressed, and you get 7, you're not. A very sort of empirical basis for something that's very subtle and complex. Was there a personal experience in your personal journey as a human being, not just in helping people, but your own evolution?
Well, you see, I got to the point where I actually regretted becoming a psychiatrist and was nostalgically thinking back to the animated movies, and something extremely powerful happened. We got from the pharmaceutical company in Sandoz a sample of a substance called LSD-25, and it came with a letter, this is a new investigational substance discovered in the laboratories of Sandoz practically by accident by Dr. Hoffman, who happened to intoxicate himself when he was...
So is this sort of LSD, different to LSD, the recreational drug that is used, just because it's LSD-25?
It's the same, just used differently.
Okay.
So anyway, they asked us, would we work with it and give them feedback whether there was a legitimate use. And they said on the basis of their pilot studies, there could be two different uses. One, to use it as a model psychosis, to give it to normal, quote-unquote, subjects, and do all kinds of examinations before, during, and after, and get some deep insight as to what might be happening chemically in people who have spontaneous episodes of similar kinds of states. And it's always great to have a model in science. And then there was the second tip, which kind of became my destiny. They said they felt that it could be used as a very unconventional educational tool, that psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, medical students would have a chance to spend a few hours in the world that's very much like the world of their patients. And so...
What kind of patients? Patients who are having spiritual emergencies, or
No, this was much broader. You know, the non-ordinary states of consciousness that current psychiatry labels as psychosis, and sees as very, very serious mental diseases. And so what happens in psychedelic sessions is that you have visions, you can be overwhelmed by powerful emotions, and you can have experiences on a very wide spectrum that really pretty much coincide with what you find in spiritual literature, from hellish to celestial, to paradisian, to ecstatic raptures, mystical states, and so on.
Well, you have used LSD with terminal cancer patients to give them prepare them in a sense for death, to overcome the fear of death. But isn't there what about the fear about LSD per se, that you use it and you go out of control and you become addicted to it? Are you sort of recommending LSD?
Well, I don't want to come out as a propagandist for LSD. Actually, my interest could be defined as interest in non-ordinary states, a very wide spectrum of which those induced by psychedelics are just one category. My wife and I developed also what we call holotropic breathwork, where you can induce very powerful states just like that, with faster breathing, with powerful evocative music, a certain kind of body work, which of course brings it very close to the Eastern spirit.
The pranayama of yoga.
Yeah.
Just sort of to stay for a moment with LSD. I think the most famous book perhaps was Aldous Huxley, Dose of Perception, where he worked with mescaline. But I think at the end of it, the fear was that the experiences, the altered states of consciousness that come out through the use of chemicals, don't endure and keep and could leave behind traces of psychological or psychic damage. If those experiences weren't circumscribed, we use the analogy of yoga. In yoga we have a strong moral framework. You do yamas and niyamas, and you move up the ladder before you go into these sort of altered states of consciousness, so that you can handle what they throw up. Isn't there a risk that if you do these sort of how to put it, accelerated processes of experiencing this, that things could go badly wrong? There
are actually two aspects of the question that you're asking. One, it doesn't last, and the other one, it can be dangerous. Those are really different. So the first one, it's true. I mean, what you never lose, once you have a profound experience of that kind, it changes your philosophy for life. You will never return to the monistic, materialistic worldview. It's very common for Westerners. Very few escape that kind of a straitjacket of thinking. So you lose the intensity, the experiential part. It's very difficult to kind of return to that state in everyday life, to find that same kind of a perception, to see the world, for example, as something that's created by consciousness rather than by matter and so on. And it's particularly true in Western culture, where there's so much temptation, you see, that's happening, materialistic temptation, and also pressures of various kinds, achievements, goals and so on. So the culture kind of sucks you back, but you never lose the memory, and your philosophy is permanently changed.
We'll come to the second part in a moment. You're watching a conversation with Dr. Stanislav Grof. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Dr. Stanislav Grof. We were talking about altered states of consciousness, and you answered the first part of the question. What about the second aspect?
So you also brought up another thing, which was those experiences don't have the same value as they would have
because they're not circumscribed perhaps by a moral framework.
Dr. Houston Smith, who's a very famous religious scholar, wrote The Religions of Man. And I think he sort of presented the most balanced view. He said, phenomenologically, the psychedelic experiences with the spiritual content cannot be really distinguished from those that you read about in spiritual literature. But they would not have the same value unless they happen in the context of serious spiritual quest. You know, you've done a lot of reading, you are interested in spirituality in the first place, you have some kind of spiritual discipline, and you also continue to cultivate that experience. It's not just a one-time shot. So that would be my answer to the first part of your question. The second one, you know, substances like LSD are tools. And so to ask whether it's dangerous or whether it's beneficial would be like asking the question, is a knife a terribly dangerous tool, or is it something very useful? And some people would be talking about a surgeon, what a surgeon can do with proper training and so on. And somebody else could be a chief of New York police talking about all the murders that were committed by knife. And somewhere in between would be housewives who think about it as a tool that is very useful when you're cooking, and maybe an artist thinking about it as something that you can carve wood with. So the many things. What psychedelics do, they open your unconscious. Now whether this will be destructive or transformative, evolutionary, doesn't depend on the substance itself. It's what we call set and setting. Who gives it to whom, under what circumstances, for what purpose? Are you studying it as a chemical warfare, or are you interested in it as a therapeutic tool? That makes big difference.
Of course, there are sort of many legal inhibitions now and fears about using it as a therapeutic tool, and so you have evolved other mechanisms and other techniques to recreate some of those mental states. What about you? What has been your personal journey? How have you felt transformed by the engaging of this as a human being, not just as a therapist, as an academic? Do you feel greater compassion? Do you feel greater, I don't know what, affinity with the universe? You know, the kinds of things we normally associate with spiritual experience.
Very much. You know, I was brought up without any religious influences. My parents had the idea that we should choose our own path when we come of age. And so from this basically atheistic or non-theistic framework, then I went to medical school, which certainly doesn't cultivate mystical awareness particularly. And it was actually in Prague at the time when we had a Marxist regime, so very strict materialistic philosophy and so on. So I was coming into this research as somebody who had a very scientific, monistic, materialistic worldview. Today, I really embrace the mystical, spiritual traditions. The mystical worldview makes much more sense to me than the materialistic worldview. In terms of personal transformation, I think I experienced much more inner peace. I wouldn't say I was a pathological case, but I was very driven as a young person. I felt that life was too short and that so many exciting things, and I would read one book and think about starting another one. Whereas now I feel really deep peace, and I know when I am doing something I cannot do something else, and actually more gets done with that kind of attitude one.
Has God or the divine entered into this?
I have had many spiritual experiences during those 50 years that I've been doing this work. So I was not just working with others, but I was having
working with yourself.
There was one level where I encountered deities from different cultures, what Jung would call archetypal figures, many of them from different cultures, from mythologies that I didn't know at the time. So there was a wide range of that, but then I had experiences which actually transcended the sort of a concrete divinity, and I think there were two very profound types of experiences that I had, which I would consider encounter was the ultimate. One was paradoxically experience of sort of cosmic emptiness, kind of primordial nothingness. Yet I felt that nothing was missing. All of existence was there in an absolutely abstract form. And it was very clear to me that this is the matrix out of which creation emerges.
Would this have some sort of parallels or reflections of the Buddhist idea of shunyata or emptiness?
Void, yeah,
Void.
that you read about, yes. And then the other experience was quite different. I mean, the best I can do is to liken it to just incredibly brilliant source of light. Something like when you read in the mystical literatures and they liken it to millions of suns and so on. But it doesn't do it justice to call it light. I mean, there was also incredible creativity that was there. There was consciousness, even a certain sense of humor, and again a sense that that's the author, that's the creative principle, and that the way creation happened is really by orchestration of experiences, by creating experiences and orchestrating them in a certain way. You know, very different from how I used to think about the world as being made of stuff.
You were talking about this spiritual experience. Was it a surprise? Is it always a surprise? But when you've done so much work, is it anywhere? I mean, you anticipate it in some ways, and spiritual masters will tell you, no, don't think about it, because when it happens, it needs to be a pure experience and not circumscribed by predisposition or prediction. So what happened to you?
Well, I was in that situation as Freudian analyst. I was in this crisis. I didn't think that we can help people sufficiently and also fast enough. And so for me, LSD initially was a tool that could deepen or accelerate psychoanalysis. I thought basically the experiences that would be coming would be within the map that I was taught in the medical school when I was studying psychiatry. And of course that it didn't happen. Sooner or later, every single person that we worked with would transcend the Freudian framework. First, the realm that they would go into, powerful experiences of death rebirth that seem to be related to actually reliving of biological birth. Showing that there is a powerful record in our unconscious of all those hours that we spent in the birth canal, being born, struggling for life and so on. Basically encountering death in the very process of getting life. And then sooner or later for different people it opened up into a vast realm that we now call transpersonal, which is dissolution of body boundaries and experiencing identification with other people, experiencing group consciousness, becoming all the children of the world, or all the mothers of the world, or all the soldiers of the world for that matter. Transcending the human boundaries, identifying with animals and getting new insight beyond what we knew intellectually. Then another thing that happened is transcending time. Some of these experiences suddenly were happening in other centuries, in other countries, very powerful, and associated with a kind of sense that psychiatrists call déjà vu, which is this is not the first time it's happening to me. I have been there before, and I'm now experiencing something from one of my previous lifetimes. And it connected us, of course, to all the different spiritual traditions that that believe in reincarnation, connection with karma, and so on. And then it opened into another vast area which Carl Gustav Jung called archetypal. You suddenly could experience deities and demonic entities from different mythologies and visit realms, the paradises, the hells, the heavens. So the whole mythology of humanity came alive. So that was quite an expansion of the cartography as compared to what I was brought up with.
Experientially, Western civilization, Western psychiatry is obsessed with the notion of happiness. Did that change for you? What is happiness? I mean, when I asked you in what ways the experience had transformed you, you mentioned equanimity, being more at peace. Has it changed the way you look at happiness? What is the aspiration of a patient or a human being engaged in the processes of life and living?
I think actually the ambition of Western psychiatry is much less than seeking happiness. There's a very famous quote by Freud when he says that the goal of psychoanalysis was to change the extreme suffering of the neurotic into the ordinary misery of everyday life. So the idea that you could be happy was not really part of it. The goal is to be without symptoms. And so it had to be transpersonal psychology, or even humanistic psychology, maybe bringing that goal, which was a little more ambitious than getting rid of symptoms.
What is the role of suffering in many of the Eastern traditions? To experience pain, to experience suffering, becomes an instrument for one's evolution. And how you process that. It also creates empathy with other people's pain and suffering. So in your worldview, what is the role of pain?
Well, and again, in my work and in my own experiences, the suffering was encountered very frequently at the gate to a very expanding, very positive experience. In Nara, in Japan, there is this beautiful temple, gigantic bronze statue of the Buddha. And as you walk in, there are two gatekeepers, the most horrifying creatures that you can imagine, so that your consciousness kind of fills with the horror, and then you pass by, and then it opens up into the ultimate. So this is very much what happens in the work with non-ordinary states, that healing comes very frequently through suffering. Probably the most transforming experience is the experience of psycho-spiritual death rebirth. When you really go to the ultimate, you have the feeling that you're
dark
losing
night
your
of
life.
the soul, yes.
And tremendous anguish, and then the very, very powerful opening happens.
There's a great deal of interest and work on the neurobiology of emotions, of even consciousness is what they're trying to explore, and obviously there are parallels from drug-induced altered states of consciousness. In the Eastern traditions, we've had a notion of sadhana, of effort, of practice, of striving, and yet you're able to offer workshops and techniques that go for week-long or 2 weeks or 7 weeks of engaging in processes. Is there a value that you see in this process of sadhana? The relationship with the guru, of a karmic connection between the guru and the teacher, or is there the risk that with drug-induced altered states of consciousness, those processes could be sort of, in a sense, short-circuited, and we have the equivalent of spiritual experiences, but they don't really result in the kind of enduring transformation. And you mentioned the memory of a psychedelic experience that brings about values of love, compassion, service, Mother Teresa or whoever.
As I mentioned before, Houston Smith, he said that, you can have the most blissful experience, and if it's out of context, it really very likely will not do very much for your life. If these experiences happen in the context of spiritual practice, they have a much better chance of really transforming.
I'm trying to locate this in the techniques and your teaching, with the California Institute of Integral Sciences of Philosophy, and how do you seek to recreate the traditional process, or do you?
Well,
or is this an alternative?
We see powerful experiences in our training of facilitators for the breathwork, where it's not a one-time experience, but people really study for several years and they do the breathwork, and this also includes a lot of teaching of transpersonal psychology. We combine it with other things like meditation and so on, and there we can see really lasting changes in people. But it takes, even with powerful tools, it still takes years before you can see that.
I've been in it. Going back to this, just touching on this issue of neurobiology again, does the process of spiritual experiences and that journey have biological equivalents in the brain? Is that something that you believe? Are you able to change the biochemistry of the brain, or change parts of the brain? They become larger or smaller? Is it measurable in some empirical way? Is there a correlation?
See, I mean, we know Western science has an enormous number of observations showing that there is a systematic correlation between what's happening in the brain and the states of consciousness. You can have pathological processes in certain parts of the brain and it changes consciousness, or you do something to the supply of oxygen to the brain, it changes consciousness. So nobody would argue that this is proven beyond any reasonable doubt. But what is wrong is the conclusion that was made, that this means that consciousness is actually generated in the brain. It's certainly mediated and there is a deep connection. But to say that this is a proof of it coming from the brain would be like saying that some malfunctioning of the elements in the television set are a proof that the program is generated in the TV set. It still leaves the possibility open that to receive the program you need the TV set, but the program is coming from somewhere else. So this is much more how I would see that. That's this enormous amount of evidence showing that consciousness can do things that the brain cannot possibly do. We have now observations from thanatology, the science that studies death and dying, any number of observations that people are in a state of not just cardiac death, but also brain death. And consciousness leaves the body and they see what's happening in the room. They can go through the walls and see what's happening in other rooms of that same building, and they can even have experiences of something that's happening 3,000 miles away. And if you have an open-minded researcher, those things are really there. You can consensually validate them. And the most recent development was Ken Ring, who did a series of studies of people who were congenitally blind. They had never seen anything in their life, and when they were in a near-death situation, their consciousness was able to perceive the environment.
As someone who's had a lifelong engaging in altered states of consciousness and aspiring in the manner that you have to the pursuit of the goals of spiritual experience, what aspirations do you have for yourself? What you seek in your own growth, or are you, as in the case of many spiritual masters or aspirants, have had a peak experience and now there is just the world to examine? What's left for you?
Well, I don't see myself as a guru. I see myself as a seeker, as a probably eternal student. I'm very, very fascinated by this whole realm. It has become my passion. I mean, what you can discover in these non-ordinary states. In terms of what it has done to my life, I already mentioned much more inner peace. Certainly it increased tremendously my level of tolerance. I think about myself as a planetary citizen. I hope that we're moving towards planetary civilization. I would like to see a world where violence is not an acceptable means of solving problems. I would like to see, a world where we respect ecology as biological beings, that we realize we need clean air, clean water, clean earth that's feeding it.
And good heart. Thank you very much. This has been a great privilege, a great honor, and a great learning experience. And I will now shake your hand. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.